All right, greetings. Hopefully your first week of school was pretty good. I've been having an okay time. Google Classroom's a little, little tricky. I don't know, whatever, but we're getting it. We're getting it, so we'll figure it out together. Right now, obviously I've sent you some videos over the week. Hopefully you've been watching these videos, but remember this class is not just about me sending you videos. But the point is, if someone, literally the author themselves, has talked about their work, might as well give you that link instead of me pontificating of what things are about. That said, I might have been getting ahead of myself because what do you even know about comics, right? Probably not everything. Certainly not. Who does? But you got to start somewhere. And that somewhere probably starts with a glossary of comics. So that's what we're going to talk about right here. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down all the words that I say and the definitions. I'm not going to provide you with a list of this stuff because I'd rather you write them down as I go along. Pause the video as you need to go. I talk pretty fast, but this will help you retain some of this information, and you can even doodle some of the examples that I've given you here. So let's get into it with our very first term. It's called a panel. So a panel, obviously very easy, a rectangle or a square where the action in the comic is drawn, and comics are made up of a series of panels. A tier is actually T-I-E-R. A tier is a single row of panels. So comic strips are tiers, one after the other in the newspaper, and your first rows and things like that in comics are tiers. Then you got symmetry, standard art term, obviously the same shape, size, and position on both sides of a dividing line. Both sides of a comic book can be the pages, can be like that, and we'll get into some of those terms later, because that leads into a splash page. That's a panel that usually takes up the entire page, and it's used to help introduce stories or give special attention to particular events, usually action, big punches, explosions, big reveals. You turn that page and all of a sudden, there they are, this person, this villain, whoever it is. So it's good for use of pacing and obviously use of impact, the size and shape of panels and the size and shape of that spread, or that splash rather, because we're going to get to the word spread in a moment. So after that, we've got lines. What do we got? Lines, it's comics. They suggest movement, body language, non-verbal communication through gestures, facial expressions, behaviors, and posture. Obviously, body language means a lot, all that stuff. Line, very important in all forms of art media. But here in comics, line and line work, very specific and special to this art form. You've also got the way these characters speak. They're going to speak in balloons or think in these balloons. Word balloons, thought balloons, all these types of balloons are the ways we convey speaking, as well as other ways to talk. If you've got a dotted word balloon, right, the dotted one, that usually conveys whispering. So that's interesting. And some characters even play with their word balloons. I do that with some of my characters, but famously like Ghost Rider's word balloons are black and like on fire with white text. So it's a good way to show some character even in the design of word balloons. So that's interesting, right? We've also got narration, or the voice of a comic book that comes out of the narration box. So that's narration. Beyond that, we've got a silhouette. Silhouette is an outline that appears dark against a light background, usually shape is a big way to tell it that. Sequence and or light against dark background really helps provide contrast. It's important to make images stand out. Inking, a big part of what makes this happen. We'll talk about inking in a moment. We've got motif. So this is an interesting term. It's the underlying idea that is a recurrent element in literary or artistic work. So things like it's a drama or it's an action, things like that. Those are motifs. It's almost like a theme of what's going on. Shadings, the graded markings that indicate light or shaded area. In a drawing or painting, used to create the illusion of depth. Again, shading is an interesting term here in comics because a lot of it is not rendering like we think about in illustration. It's shading. It can literally just be black and non-ink. So you can literally be shading someone and just sweeping blacks, and that's like a noir type of look, a very graphic style. So don't think of shading as an entire line of that. In comics, it's a lot of just the use of blacks is how they shade, and as well as cross-hatching and things like that when it comes to line and all that stuff. Lettering is a different font style and size, can be used to draw attention or emphasis to words. Sometimes you'll be reading comics and sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, where they'll be talking in some words in bold. How do you read that, right? A lot of older comics do that, where randomly all these words appear in bold. So keep that in mind when writing books, is that you can emphasize things with italics, you can emphasize things with underline, bold, and again, back to Ghost Rider, how the way these letters, words, symbols, and all that are portrayed, even in their word balloons. It's something to think about when talking about how characters are created and how they communicate, because everything infers on each other. I have a cartoon character. His name is Pig Venus. There he is. He's adorable. And I decided to make his word balloons actually have, instead of little word tails like that, like we've got a word balloon and tails, a curly Q tail, like a curly pigtail. So pretty fun, right? It adds a little bit of character and lets you know which character is speaking. So we've got that. What else do we have after that? We've got shading, we've got coloring. Coloring is the use of color in a piece of artwork, obviously. We've used many different styles of color throughout the entire history of comics. It used to be a 4-color separation, similar to how your printer works, using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And that's the way comics printed, which is why when you zoom in on those comics, when they're printed on those new prints, you see lots of dots, all those little dots, Ben-Day dots and this that become known for being used in comics. Some of it has to do with the old printing style of it, and then that carries forth into pop art and how they carry on. And in modern times, use digital coloring. Digital coloring has obviously changed the entire spectrum of comics. That said, some comics from the past have been recolored in modern times using digital coloring, and it does take away from the art. It really does. Color in general can take away from the art because color conveys a lot of emotion. If you don't use it correctly, it can really muddy up your work. And later on, when digital comes around, these color choices that people made in older books really inferred a lot of the feeling and the tone. And they used their limited canvas of colors to what strength they could to communicate that language. So then later on, when someone 20 years later just comes and they just get assigned to digitally color something, things become very toned down and boring. And that original colorist or artist who did the color, if it was the same person, whatever message they were trying to convey through the color is lost because of the digital color. Now, similar to back in the day when I was growing up, they tried to colorize movies for a little while on like the Turner Network, where they colorized these old black and white movies and they looked monstrous. Like they looked absolutely terrible. Modern technology, I believe, can have you color old black and white photos to see them in color now, and perhaps the coloring of film has advanced, but it's horrible looking. And usually coloring stuff later can ruin something, and it takes away from the initial colorist's design. So keep that in mind. Color is very powerful. Narrative or sequential art, that is images used to or in a series or an arrangement in which things follow a logical order or pattern portraying the passing of time. This is basically the basis of all comics. So as you heard about Scott McCloud, and as I'll go on in another video, comics, essentially more than anything, is this agreement between time and moments, right? Where here's an image, time happens in between this, and now it's the next moment, right? So you got moment, time, moment, time, moment, time. That's kind of how things work. You know, the picture would be typically man in a hat, man out of his hat, and that space in between is the time in which I've done this that your brain automatically fills in. And that's how it works. Kind of a very, archaic animation. Our brains fill in the blank between the panels. So where is that blank line between the panels? You know what that's called? That's the gutter. That's where time exists. It's in the gutters of where all these panels create on a page. Panels on a page, all arranged in an order of sequential art, create gutters in between those panels. The gutters represent time passing, and that's what comics are. So more than anything. What do we got here? We've got a graphic novel. That's what this class is essentially called. Is there a difference between comics and a graphic novel? To some degree, yes. To some degree, no. Graphic novel is an interesting term that's been, kicked about over the past few years. It was really invented in, I think, the late 70s to the 80s by Will Eisner, is when graphic novels started to be used. And it was to elevate this term so that comics, you're not thinking about Dennis the Menace when we're talking about Mouse. Okay, and we'll get into Mouse later. That's one of Art Spiegelman's greatest works, Eisner Award winner. Very important, very important. It won another big award, this big award. Can you believe it? Yes, that one. So think about that as we go on, because comics is a very broad definition, and graphic novel really tries to class up the joint, is what it's kind of trying to do. So here's like a specific definition of graphic novel. A graphic novel can take a few different forms in the world of comic books. It is often a collection of previously printed comic book material that spans a story arc. So that's one way. You've got issues 1 through 8 of Spider-Man telling a story up. That story's done. Issue 9 is a new artist, new writer. We're going to take issues 1 through 8, put it in one book, and sell it now for a while. All those comics got printed once, and they start to dissipate. The graphic novel is available for pretty much, in perpetuity, kind of just nonstop, I think. So we've got that saying that. There's also a completely original graphic novels referred to as OGN. I don't believe that term really exists as much anymore. It's really kind of dated. These graphic novels are usually either hardcover or have a softer cardboard cover that's so much thicker than regular comic books. This typically have near 100 pages or more. Again, These are fuzzy rules. If you wrote one story that was never published singularly, it's 90 pages, it's a graphic novel. Absolutely it is, okay? Now, is a graphic novel, is it a comic? Yeah. Is it a comic book? No, a comic book is, usually one piece of a story, can be a whole story in a single issue. But once you get toward, I'm going to say 80 pages, an 80-page giant is about as much as a comic book gets to. Past that, you are looking into having to get that hard bind on the side, which makes it more of a novel. If that clears any of this up, you can put it on a bookshelf like that, and there's a spine. Obviously, that's our difference between comic books and comic book graphic novels. So something to think about there. A shot is similar to film, okay? The framing of a panel, you got long shots, full body or landscape, medium shots, displaying items or characters. From the waist up around here is a medium shot, and then close up, like when I'm leaning in to figure things out and look at this. You got something real close. Zooming in on people's eyes when they're suddenly shocked. That's a good way to think of a close-up, obviously. We talked about the gutter. A trade paperback differs from a graphic novel. I was wondering about this, and that a graphic novel is usually original material, so going against what that definition was before. It's also different from the publishing term trade paperback, which is a book with a flexible cardstock cover that is larger than the standard mass market paperback format. So think about that. That's what some people say, is that, oh, this is a trade because it's a different size. And it used to be a size having to do with printing. So some of these old industry terms having to do with printing, they get mucked up in modern times. Seems like a trade paperback differs from a graphic novel, and that a graphic novel is usually original material, and they start talking about the size and types of stuff that they printed on. That is not as important, all right? So some people are going to call these things TPBs, trade paperbacks. They're going to call them graphic novels. They're going to mean the same thing. They're going to call them comics, meaning The Watchmen, still the same thing, right? It's kind of this bunch of synonyms now. There's not too much of a difference. Even when this class was starting, and it's called A History of Comic Books and the Graphic Novel, to me, I was like, so you mean the history of comic books? There is a slight difference, but as time goes on, I believe that that difference is just fading away because less and less people need to justify comics by calling them graphic novels and trying to elevate them. Because a lot of us that are growing up now believe comics are art and we respect them. So that's some of why some of these terms exist. Now let's talk about just the terms that go into what it takes to make a comic. You see, a comic is actually the job of many people. This is what some independent comic artists forget. So a comic is usually made up of a cartoonist or an artist, a cartoonist, sometimes they're called. I prefer to call myself a cartoonist, but that's because I usually do draw more cartoon characters, things more like Looney Tunes. And an illustrator, an artist, you look at comics, a lot of them are amazing. You're not going to call Alex Ross a cartoonist. He's certainly an artist. So that said, we'll just call it the artist. Then you've got your writer. This is the person that, maybe scripts it, plots the whole thing, and writes the whole thing, writes all the dialogue, writes the script. Comic scripts are interesting in that most comic scripts, if you are writing them, if page one is just inset shot outside of Wayne Manor, panel, big panel, Batman, or Bruce Wayne sits in his chair thinking at the Bat computer, okay? That's just all that is, right? So that inset shot and then that shot, that's going to be one page of script. It's going to say, inset shot, this and that. We see Bruce Wayne mulling over something about the Bat computer. That's it. And then you just go to the next page of script, because then that represents page two. Now, page two could be 9 panels, and it can go to 1.5 pages of script, right? And then you get to that other half page, up, leave the rest blank, turn. That's how comic scripts are written, so that each page represents a page in that book. That's the idea. Whether it's one panel that's going to say explosion, boom, or it's going to be 9 panels with lots of stuff. Either way, 1 page of script, 1 page of comic art. That's the idea. Here's an interesting little note on that. So we all know The Watchmen, right? The Watchmen is considered one of the greatest graphic novels, one of the greatest comic stories, one of the greatest comic things of all time. The way I just told you about how a comics page, okay, infers how many pages in the book. Page 1 of script, page 1 of a book. Page 1, 2 is that. When Alan Moore wrote the script for The Watchmen to give to Dave Gibbons, the artist, he wrote a page of script for each panel. Think of that. That's how much effort he put into The Watchmen. Isn't that fascinating? Think of that. That means 9 panels on 1 page, because you use the standard 9-panel format, sometimes 3 panels, sometimes 1 long panel, and then another 2, but it's 9-panel format, okay? All of that. That could mean sometimes 9 pages of script for 1 page to tell Dave Gibbons exactly what to draw. Some writers do not do this. They say, boom, that artist gets to draw whatever type of explosion they want. Certain writers, they do say, write this, it's a mushroom cloud style explosion. We certainly see debris. I want the warehouse's logo to be in the foreground of the shot because that's going to be a foreshadowing for some other thing, right? So you're trying to control what you're creating. That's the idea. Some people have different rules about this that are really insane. Other people let the artist go nuts. That's how things work. It's a team effort. That's the point of comics. Team effort. So we've got our writer, we've got our artist, we've got Okay, so by artist, let's think about that and break that down. You got penciler, right? So the artist can also be considered the penciler. That's the person who puts down the very first basic line work for this entire project, deciding on panel placement, panel arrangement, the figures, the settings, the backgrounds, the characters, facial expressions, and poses. Next, it's going to go to the inker. The inker is or finisher, as they were called back in the day. An inker or finisher finishes and sometimes enhances the penciled artwork using ink, traditionally India ink. And with a pen or a brush, I prefer a brush. You can use both. You can use them all to create a high contrast image for photographing and printing. Remember, all comics used to be photocopied, and that's how they delivered them. Comics are drawn on 11 by 17 paper usually, and then shrunk down, I think 60% or 70%, some percentage. That's how they used to do this on photocopiers, and that's why they used to draw in blue line pencil, non-repro blue. It's a moot point now because we scan everything and we can scan all the colors. But it used to be non-repro blue, so you could draw whatever you want, ink over it. You don't got to worry about erasing. You photocopy it a little smaller, and now you have a beautifully inked comic page that is clear of any pencil marks because they do not reproduce. Old technology, now you do whatever. Obviously now you draw lightly and erase. So going forward, we've got inker. After the inker, it looks like we have a colorist. The colorist adds that color to the finished artwork, which can have an effect on mood, meaning, all of that sort of thing. Hues make a huge difference. Tone makes a huge difference, obviously, in color. A lot of comics, some of the best ones, have 3 colors and that's it. Think about that. A good way to do noir comics is strictly black and white, maybe some gray tones. One of my favorite comics is Batman Black and White. A lot of these original Batman stories that are black and white. Right now, they have Harley Quinn, black, white, and red is coming out. So you can imagine what that is. It's black and white comics with only the color red being used. It looks great. I've wanted to do this in the past. There's another famous book I love so much, Hero Bear, that does this, where they pick one color, and that's the one color that is used besides black and white, right? So something to think about. Another good one is like black, blue, and yellow. I might be able to find a good arrangement as an example for that. After that, you've got a letterer. Letterer is normally accepted from the writer. The letterer is a person who literally crafts the graphic design of lettering, right? Think of letters as symbols, not letters. Is always what I try to tell people. You're drawing letters, okay? You're drawing symbols that convey language. All they are is symbols. So if you have terrible handwriting, slow down and think about it as symbols, because you can still letter your comic even if you have terrible handwriting, because you're drawing letters. Think of it like that. Also, letters, these people might be in charge of the sounds also. So sound effects, things like that, which is great because sounds are a lot more interesting than just that comic font, right? So you got sounds and sound effects. That's also handled by the letterer. That said, actually, as I think about something, fonts exist, right? You can make a comic and use fonts, but traditionally they still use letterers in comics because there is a craft to it and they respect the craft. It might go away. Maybe it goes away. Who knows? But right now, letterers are still an occupation. It's a job you can get in the comics field. So think of that. I want you to think of that right now. What did I just name? I didn't even name a publisher or an editor, right? So we might have an artist that lays out the very idea. I don't know. Usually it's called the penciler, in my opinion. Then you got an inker. Then you've got a colorist. Then you've got a letterer, right? And then you've got someone that has to edit and approve all this stuff and really just... So a comic is kind of the job of like 5, 6 people. Think of that, all right? Think of that. Sometimes all these people making independent comics, they're trying to do the job of 5 or 6 people, okay? So keep that in mind, that you do not have to be amazing at all of it to get a job in the industry. Todd McFarlane said that if you're, and I think I might have said this in a different example, but I'll say it again, I'll say it a lot. All right, I've made my own comic. I'm a pretty good illustrator. I'm terrible at lettering. My inking's actually very, very good. My coloring is trash, and I can't really write because I'm too verbose. Guess what? Work on that inking. Okay, get a job at a company doing that inking. You are very good at inking. Hone that skill. Get to the place that you want to be. And once you're the place you want to be, try to get the job you want to have. That's how some things work. That's called what color is your parachute, all right? You cannot move diagonally to a job that you want. You can move in a grid. Think of a window, 4 panels, right? If you can visualize that, I'll put a graphic up. You are either going to get a job at the place you want, not doing the thing you want to do, or you're going to get a job doing the thing that you want to do, but not doing it where you want. You cannot move diagonally. You've got to go one and another. So think of life like that. If you have a real goal that you want to get, remember that old story of, I started at Marvel as the janitor, and then I was the editor. That guy got that job as the janitor because he knew he wanted to be the editor and said, I'll do whatever it takes to get my foot in the door and just keep working and bothering people. And nothing happens overnight. People that make that achievement usually are there for 20 years. So think of that. As far as comics concerned, we've got more types of comics than what I've discussed. We've got a comic strip. Comic strips, obviously short comics, the origins in newspapers usually, and that's usually where they stay, but you can collect them into other sorts of things, and they appear in various periodicals like magazines as well. Comic strips are, only a small amount of really time. They don't have to be a linear story. I did realize that the dailies, as they were called, might be a linear story, right? Because I used to deliver the newspapers, so I would notice, on Monday, Garfield got stuck in the blinds, right? On Tuesday, he's in the blinds still. On Wednesday, he's in the blinds, and John tries to get him out. John's in the blinds. On Thursday, Odie's in the blinds. On Friday, they're all in the blinds, and then someone else happens. On Saturday, they fall in the blinds. Sunday is a brand new thing. That stands alone. Maybe Monday is a brand new thing that starts the dailies again, but Sunday is usually its own separate thing, regardless of continuity, where it's just its own thing because some people get the newspaper every day, but a lot of people would just get the paper on Sundays, right? Something to think about. So we've got that, then there's the Sundays as we go on, and then there's a gag. A gag is a type of comic strip that's not a strip. A gag is a one-panel cartoon, like The Far Side, Ziggy, Family Circus, and then also a lot of political cartoons or editorial cartoons are used in this manner. You don't often see them, besides Doonesbury being political, as like sequential. Usually they're just one single image, one single thing. So think of that when it comes to a lot of political cartoons. My man, Dave Fitzsimmons, one of the best cartoonists around. He happens to live right here in Tucson, Arizona. He's an amazing political cartoonist. Yes, they're all constant one panels. Brilliant stuff. Look up Dave Fitzsimmons. We're going to try and get him to visit the school soon. Web comics is a newer term as far as comic strips. Web comics are obviously comic strips that happen on the internet, over on that World Wide Web. Manga or manga, pardon my accent, manga, I say it the other day. All right, or katakana hiragana, as it's pronounced, is used in Japan to refer to both comics and cartooning, but outside Japan, the word typically is used to refer to comics originally published in that country. So there's a good amount of vocabulary for you. I went through it a bit quick. Hopefully I'm going to add all these visuals that'll help you out. Try to throw some examples over my silly face so that you're not staring at this. And you gain something, and it's something we can discuss later on. I've got discussion questions coming for you later. I'm not too worried about giving you some sort of vocabulary test, but all of these terms are good for you to know so that when I go forward, I'm talking about, well, use the narration box to figure out how you're going to tell that story and then maybe make her think about it. That means that use a box so that it moves the story along, and then she has a thought balloon without me having to say all the specific terms, okay? So just make sure you make yourself well aware of some of these terms. I might just give you a list of them because I do have some of them here, but I don't know, I think I did a pretty good job. Why don't you write them down? How about that? I'm going to record some instructions right now, and you can write them down as you go instead of me providing them to you. I'm going to put this right in the front. All right, now we're just going to end the video properly. Thanks for checking this out. I hope that you enjoyed this. I'm going to try and make these things fun. Again, this was a bit long, but it looks like that's just the way a class works. So the next video is going to cover a little more understanding comics, some of that ancient history of comics, and I'm going to try and blast that discussion questions coming up at the end of the week. Look for those, and they'll be due in a week, just so you know. So there we go. That's the end of this one. Vocabulary for comics. All done.